There was snow in her hair before she could even answer the door. The knock came fast and hard, 3 sharp raps that rattled the frame. Her hand was still raw from splitting pine that morning, and as she pulled the warped door open against the wind, the mailman's breath was already fogging in the air between them. He didn't step inside. He didn't offer comfort or firewood or even a kind look, just a yellow envelope and a tight-lipped nod before turning away into the storm that was beginning to sweep up the ridge. The letter came from the town council, 5 names stamped at the bottom, all men who wouldn't survive a week alone without their wives telling them where the axes were kept. 5 men who'd barely looked her in the eye since her husband's coffin went into the earth 6 months back, the 2 feet of mud and rainwater filling the grave before they could even get the lid shut. Madam Rourke, the letter read, in spidery script, pursuant to the agreed widow's allotment following the passing of Daniel Rourke and the dissolution of his claim at parcel number 47, we issue the enclosed $25 payment and final notice of settlement. The parcel must be vacated or fully re-established as habitable before the first freeze of winter, or it shall revert to county ownership. $25, a deadline of 3 weeks, and snow already falling. She didn't sit down, didn't cry, just stepped back into the cabin that had no roof worth speaking of and looked at the bare floor where her baby girl had taken her first steps. Most of the roof beams had collapsed after the last storm, wet rot in the joists, a carpenter's curse if there ever was one. The old stone stove hadn't held heat since her husband passed. She'd been burning furniture to keep warm at night, and now they wanted the land, her only land. She read the letter again. Habitable, no definition, no measurements, no checklist, just one word. She didn't need to make it fancy, she just needed to survive. And that's when she made the first decision. She wouldn't leave. She'd build something, anything, with what she had, with what she could get, with what she could beg or trade or dig up. That night she sat by the dying coals, snow blowing through the holes in the wall, and made a list in her head. Not what she wanted, just what she had. 1 cast iron pan, 3 wool blankets with holes, her husband's hatchet dulled, 2 broken chairs, a bucket, and $25 in cash. She buried the envelope in the stove ash so the wind wouldn't take it, then stood and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. She stepped outside and stared across the small rise where the old cabin slumped like a beaten mule. She didn't need much, just 4 walls, a roof that held, heat that stayed, and something, anything, that would show the councilman that she was still alive. The next morning, she hitched up the old mule she'd kept fed through the summer and took the last sack of dried beans into town. The snow was deeper than she expected, already 2 inches by dawn and still falling, but she knew that if she didn't start that day, she wouldn't have time. The general storekeeper, Thomas Hale, was the kind of man who only talked when he smelled profit. He didn't ask about her roof or why she looked like she hadn't slept in days. I just took her beans and handed her $1.10 in coin. When she asked how much dry clay mix he had left, he squinted at her like she'd gone mad. Clay, he muttered, ain't no potter. No, she said, her voice flat. But I'm going to be warm this winter. He didn't understand it. No one did. Not at first. She bought 5 sacks of powdered clay and the cheapest shovel he had. That left her with $21.45. The rest she kept in her dress pocket, wrapped in a rag. She didn't go back to the broken cabin. Instead, she walked to the tree line behind the property, near where the soil dipped into a low depression between 2 granite ridges. It was half overgrown and hidden from town view, but she knew the spot well. Her husband had always said it would be the warmest place to sleep if the cabin ever failed. The ridges blocked the worst of the wind, and the soil had stayed unfrozen days longer than anywhere else last spring. She picked up a rock, rubbed the dirt, then she began digging. The first hole was nothing more than a shallow trench to see if the frost had set in. It hadn't, not yet. She dug until her hands bled. Then she lit a fire beside the trench and let the coals bake into the earth, just like her grandfather taught her when she was little. By nightfall, she'd hauled 2 of the clay sacks down the slope, mixed them with snow and dry moss, and started shaping them around the trench like bricks. She wasn't building a cabin, not yet. She was building into the land. 3 days passed like that. Dig, pack, shape, wait for the sun to crust the clay walls. She built with her hands, not a single nail. She shaped the walls in an arch so the snow would slide off. She dug downward more than she built upward, making the roof lower than the hillside so the wind couldn't catch it. Neighbors passed by, of course. They always did when there was something to gossip about. One of them, Meredith Collins, called down the slope, "That doesn't look much like a home, Mrs. Rourke. Looks more like a grave." The others laughed. She didn't answer, just kept packing clay. By the end of the week, she had 2 rooms, each no larger than a horse stall, but tight-sealed, thick-walled, and dug into the earth deep enough that the temperature inside never dropped below freezing, even when the wind outside screamed like it was trying to rip skin off bone. She hung her blankets across the inner doorway like curtains, made a bed from hay and old rags, and slept beside a tin lantern she'd bartered for using her husband's boots. When the first councilman came to inspect, she met him outside in the snow. He was wrapped in furs. She was not. "This is it?" he asked, looking over the low hill and the barely visible roofline covered in snow. "It's warm," she said. "You live in the ground." "I live warm." He scowled, but he didn't say no. 2 days later, the council sent a letter. No eviction, no confirmation either, just silence. So she kept building, dug another room, lined one wall with stones from the creek to store heat, shaped a bench from packed clay and old boards to keep dry firewood off the floor. But she knew the freeze was coming, and $17.80 was all she had left. So she made one last trip into town, this time not for supplies, but to ask the blacksmith something no one had ever asked him before. "How much for scrap pipe?" she asked. The blacksmith, who'd seen 100 things and expected none of them, raised one bushy brow. "What for?" "Chimney," she said. "But low, underground." He blinked. "That's not how chimneys work." "Doesn't mean it won't," she replied, and that was the moment people stopped laughing. Because when she started dragging home 3 sections of rusted stovepipe, all 20 feet long combined, it wasn't for heat alone, it was for airflow, for something even the men hadn't thought of. She wasn't just making a shelter, she was making a system, and winter had just begun. By the second week, the snow hadn't let up. Every morning, the widow woke up buried in silence, the kind only deep snow can bring, the kind that muffles the world so much you start to wonder if God turned his back in the night. But she didn't stop. Her body hurt in places that didn't used to hurt. Her hands cracked and bled, her shoulders stung from frostbitten straps where she'd hauled lumber across her back, reclaimed boards from the collapsed cabin, what was left of it. She burned what was too splintered to use, saved what had held its shape. The underground shelter, once a single sunken room with rough clay walls, was now something else entirely. She'd shaped it like a horseshoe, one chamber on either side of the entry tunnel, both narrow, both curved, just enough to bounce heat inward. The center corridor was low-ceilinged, barely shoulder height, but the roof arched enough to keep water from dripping straight down. She'd used one of the stovepipes there, embedded horizontally just beneath the ceiling, open at both ends to the outside. It didn't look like much, a rusty line running through packed earth, but the draft it created kept smoke flowing out and clean air flowing in. By week's end, she'd perfected something most men in the valley had never thought to try, a draw tunnel. While others froze in drafty cabins built to look like eastern houses, she had burrowed and breathed warm. Inside, the air moved like it was alive, slowly, quietly, but enough to keep it fresh. She learned quickly to bank coals under rocks, to vent low smoke through half pipes, to sleep on packed earth wrapped in straw where body heat would trap in like a blanket. And maybe she would have kept to herself through the whole winter. Maybe no one would have known just how well she was doing buried under snow and stubbornness. But one night, as she was pouring hot water from her stovepot into a bowl of soaked oats, there was a sound at the vent pipe, not a knock, not a voice, a cough. She froze. The cough came again, wet, rasping, and far too close. She shoved aside the wool curtain covering the entrance and crawled halfway up the corridor until her head was just beneath the air pipe. Another cough, then a voice. "Mom, I know it's late. I didn't know who else." The widow stepped out into the night. The wind had shifted. Snow was falling in waves. And standing there, one mittened hand gripping the edge of the hill, was a boy, maybe 15, face blue, legs shaking. "I didn't mean to," he stammered. "My ma, He swallowed hard. "She's down the hill. We lost our roof last night. Everything's wet. She can't move her hands." The widow didn't speak. Sa just reached out and took the boy by the coat sleeve, pulled him into the tunnel, then turned and began hiking down the slope, barefoot in the snow, teeth clenched. She found the woman in a hollow between trees, curled around a pile of damp quilts. Her hair was stiff with frost, her fingers black at the tips. The widow didn't ask names, didn't ask how they ended up here. She simply unwrapped her own shawl and laid it over the woman's back, then began dragging her through the snow on her back like a sled. It took an hour. She had no horse left. The mule had died the morning before, slipped on the icy slope and broke a leg, and she'd spent the day crying before gutting it for meat. But she got the woman inside, got her warm, got her breathing steady by dawn. The boy never left her side. "You saved us," he whispered later that night, his hands around the tin mug she'd heated with broth. "You saved us both." She didn't answer, just stared into the fire. The next morning, the boy followed her outside without being asked. She handed him the shovel, and pointed toward the east slope. "We dig another room," she said. He didn't argue. They carved out the new chamber in 3 days. She showed him how to blend straw and clay, how to pack it firm, how to curve the corners and bury dry wood at the core so the heat stayed longer. She had figured it out, every inch of it, like a woman born with the memory of ancient builders in her blood. They made shelves, bins for root storage, a vent pipe that ran the length of the new chamber and out the back so smoke never lingered. People began to notice. Again, one morning, as she hauled a log up the slope, part of a pine that had fallen near the edge of town, she caught sight of 3 men at the edge of her land, councilmen. One of them was Sheriff Duggan. The others she didn't know by name, but they all wore the same sour expression, the look of men trying not to admit they were wrong. They didn't knock. She saw them measuring with their eyes, counting the pipe ends, the length of the clay walls, the tracks in the snow. One of them muttered something about not legal and non-standard construction, but they didn't speak to her, not yet. Later that night, she wrapped her fingers around the hot metal of the stovepipe and sat back on her heels. "I can't just build forever," she whispered to herself. "Sooner or later they'll come knocking." But the next knock didn't come from the council. It came from a woman named Esther Jennings. She was 38, 2 children, husband gone last spring to pneumonia. She didn't come asking for shelter. She came asking for help building her own. "I'll work," she said. "You show me how. I'll dig. I'll mix clay. I'll watch your fire while you sleep. Please." The widow looked at the children, thin, half-starved, wrapped in shawls made of cut-up feed sacks. Then she nodded. "Start by digging 2 feet. You'll know it's right when the soil smells like iron." It didn't stop after that. By the end of the month, there were 5 other women asking for help, most of them widows. One woman's husband had simply walked off when the weather turned and never came back. They dug, they built, they copied her design with minor changes. Some added thicker firebeds, others borrowed her chimney piping idea. She loaned out her tools, her spare boards, even the tarp she'd sewn from curtains. And every time someone asked why it worked, why her shelter never froze, why it felt warm even on the coldest days, she said the same thing. "You don't build up when winter's coming. You build down. You keep the heat close. You let the wind pass over you like you're not even there." It wasn't magic. It was just smart. And it worked. What she didn't say, not aloud, was that part of her feared it would all fall apart, that the council would declare her land forfeited anyway, that someone would find some regulation buried in a dusty ledger and take it from her. But she didn't let the fear stop her. She dug more, she stored roots, she cooked mule meat until it was gone, then traded shelter knowledge for dried corn, tallow and jerky, and she waited. The snow grew deeper, the winds blew harder, cabins on the main ridge began to split at the joints. One of the larger homes, built with fine planks and milled windows, collapsed under the weight of the 4th snowstorm. Its chimney tore through the roof like a spear. 2 children nearly died before neighbors dug them out. And all the while, the widow's earth-buried home stood silent, still, warm. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't proud, but it was alive. One night, as she watched the snow fall through a gap in the vent pipe, the boy, James, she now knew, sat beside her, huddled under a shared wool blanket. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked softly. "Going east, somewhere warm?" She stared into the fire, listened to it crackle. "I used to," she said, "before I learned how to build something no one else could take." He didn't ask again. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, her walls hummed low with heat, the stones radiating what the fire had given them. She was down to $6.85 now, stored in a metal tin she buried under her bedding. But she didn't feel poor. She felt powerful, because the land hadn't taken her, the wind hadn't cracked her, the cold hadn't stolen her name. And when the next family came to her door, she didn't even wait for them to speak. She simply said, "Show me your hands. If you can still dig, I'll show you how to stay warm." The freeze came sooner than anyone expected. By the end of November, the storm that rolled over the valley had crushed 5 rooftops and choked the wells with ice. The church's steeple cracked down the middle. Even the sheriff's cabin, stout and reinforced, lost its south-facing wall to the weight of the drift. Whole families dragged their beds into root cellars, praying the firewood lasted. But the widow's home was silent. No creaks, no buckling beams, no broken glass or fallen shingles. Just earth and clay, pressed tight against the cold, absorbing the storm like it was nothing more than a heavy breath. Word spread. At first just murmurs, then names, then directions. "Follow the old pine ridge till the snow thins. You'll see smoke rising sideways. That's her vent pipe." They called her home the Mole Hut, sometimes the Burrow. Some laughed when they said it, some didn't. She didn't care. She was too busy helping Esther reinforce her second chamber, too busy teaching a teenage boy how to bank coals without smothering them, too busy passing around boiled tallow and pine resin to plug the seams of another widow's makeshift earthen stove. By early December, Her shelter had become the quiet center of something bigger. The warmth had spread, not just the heat of fire, but the kind of warmth that comes from hands offered in silence, from food shared without expectation, from firewood split and left on someone's doorstep at night. But none of it came without cost. The council noticed. A letter arrived, not hand-delivered this time, just nailed to a post where the road forked outside her property line. To Mrs. Rourke, due to multiple reports of unauthorized habitation, you are hereby summoned for review under County Code 47B, non-standard housing, unsafe construction, and unregulated tenancy. The matter shall be reviewed at the year-end assembly, December 30th. Attendance required. No signature, no warmth, just the threat of eyes. She crumpled the paper and threw it into the stove. That night she barely slept. The wind howled like wolves across the valley rim, but it wasn't the sound that kept her awake. It was the knowledge that they were coming for the thing she'd built, not because it was broken, but because it worked, and they hadn't thought of it first. She stared at the ceiling, mud packed with straw, supported by reclaimed pine beams, glazed with smoke from weeks of fire, and felt her ribs twist with something unfamiliar. Not fear, not quite, resolve. The next morning, she left the boy and the others to tend the fire and hiked into town on foot. Every face she passed carried the same look, worn, grey, tight with hunger and frostbite. No one smiled. No one asked what she was doing. She walked straight into Hale's general store and laid out her last coins, $6.85 in weathered silver and tarnished pennies. "I want every dry good you've got for that price," she said. "Flour, oats, cornmeal, not moldy, not crushed. And I want receipts." Hale stared at her like she was speaking a new language. "For what?" he asked. "For proof," she said, "that I bought it, that it's mine, that I traded fairly." He blinked, but complied. She walked out of there with a sack under each arm and the receipt pinned to her chest like a badge. Next stop, blacksmith, not for more pipe. This time for wire. Twisted, rusted, old, didn't matter. "I'm fencing off the intake vents," she said, "before someone's boot accidentally kicks one in." The blacksmith nodded, not a word, just handed her a bundle of rusted chicken wire and a roll of scrap nails. By the time she got home, the sun was falling, and 3 more strangers were waiting at the slope. 2 women, 1 man, all red-faced and desperate. "We don't need food," one of the women said. "Just space to sleep. We'll dig. We'll work. We'll share heat." The widow nodded, quietly. No big welcome, no speech, just pointed toward the far slope. "You build in 2s," she said. "Heat radiates better that way." And so the line of dugouts grew. By Christmas there were 8, each tucked into the soil like roots, each warm enough to dry socks in, each equipped with some version of the widow's air-pull vent system. None of them had chimneys that smoked straight up. That had been one of her lessons early on. Keep the warmth close, but keep your heat stealthy. Let the snow crust around the vent pipes and keep your secrets hidden beneath the frost. She walked the line each evening, checking doors, packing clay, replacing frayed ropes. She didn't ask how long they were staying, didn't ask where they came from. This wasn't charity, this was winter, and winter didn't care about pride. One night James found her sitting on a low bench of packed dirt, staring into the coals. "You should rest," he said. "I did." "No, I mean really rest." She looked up. Her eyes were rimmed red, her hands raw. He pulled something from behind his back, a tin cup, dented and old, filled with what looked like tea. "What is it?" she asked. "Spruce needle," he said. "Boiled it down with dried apple. It's not whiskey, but it's hot." She took it. For a moment, the silence between them was softer. Then he said, "You know they're going to try to shut this down." She didn't answer. "They'll say it's not a proper home. No foundation, no deed, no blueprint, still nothing." Finally he said, "But they're wrong." She sipped the tea. Steam curled around her cheeks. "I'm not asking for permission," she said. "I already built it." He smiled. Later that night, a woman from one of the newer dugouts came running through the snow. She was breathless, wild-eyed. "They're coming," she said. "Tomorrow morning, sheriff and 2 councilmen. They're bringing the county inspector." The widow didn't flinch. She stood, pulled her coat on. "Then let them come." She spent the rest of the night tidying the path to the main dugout, her original one, laid fresh straw in the corridor, lit the small clay lanterns that lined the walls, not for decoration, for clarity, so they could see it wasn't just dirt and guesswork. This was engineering. Oh, survival, a woman's answer to death. Morning came with a crunch of boots on snow. 3 men, 1 clipboard. They stood at the top of the slope, reluctant to go down. The sheriff called out, "We need to inspect the premises." The widow didn't respond, just waited. Eventually, they came. The inspector had the look of a man who thought of himself as fair, but fair only in the way a scale is fair, not a soul. He ducked into the tunnel, sniffed at the air, knocked on walls, tapped pipes, even checked the temperature near the stove. "She's burning clean," he said, almost grudgingly. "And the airflow? Better than my damn attic," he muttered. The sheriff scowled. "But it's illegal. No permits. No structural forms. No—" "Did it collapse?" The inspector cut in. No. Anyone die? No. Anyone cold? The widow finally spoke. Ask the families outside. He did. Over the next 2 hours, he visited every dugout, spoke to every woman, every child, every man who had come down from a frozen house to sleep warm in the dirt. He took notes, didn't smile, didn't frown. When he returned to the sheriff, he spoke low. Unless you want to explain to the county judge why you shut down the only warm housing in this valley, I'd let it be. And then he walked away. The sheriff didn't argue, not out loud, but he didn't come back either. That night the widow sat by her fire, knees tucked beneath a worn blanket, watching James mix more spruce needle tea for the newcomers. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. She'd won, not with fists, not with money, but with something older, something harder, something the storm could never bury. She'd taken $25 and a death sentence, and built a season of life. The storm that followed New Year's was the worst in a decade. Snow rolled off the ridge like an avalanche in slow motion, piling high enough to bury fences and chimneys alike. Some said the cold was so deep it cracked rifle barrels. Others said it was God's punishment for men who spent more time measuring deeds than digging trenches. But beneath the frozen crust, the widow's home held firm. Her walls had thickened with every week, layer after layer of clay and hay, hard as sandstone now, sealing the heat in like a stone crock. By then she could walk through her narrow halls without touching dirt, smoothed and hardened as if fire kilned. There were no candles anymore. Instead, her lanterns were rigged from tin cups, wax scraps, and bent spoons. A soft, amber glow soaked every chamber. The air was always warm, the silence always full, but the storm didn't care. It came anyway. One of the dugouts near the eastern slope collapsed under the weight of a snowdrift. It hadn't been built deep enough. The man inside, Thomas Brewer, father of 2, widower, was pulled out with both legs broken. His firewood had gone wet, his vent sealed by crusted ice. If his daughter hadn't screamed until someone heard, he'd have frozen by dawn. They laid him out inside the widow's second chamber, wrapped in quilts and warmed by stone-heated bricks. James built a bed frame out of scavenged fence posts. The widow didn't ask questions. She just tended to his leg with a splint made from mule bones and cotton strips. By now the dugout community had grown to 14 families. Some had dug their own shelters. Others shared narrow tunnels with layered sleeping spots, like burrowing animals relying on one another's heat. And still, she remained the center. They called her Ma'am, or Widow Rourke, or just her. She didn't ask for respect, but she had it. Every child was taught not to step on her vent pipes. Every adult knew to bank their coals the way she did, under rocks, never in open pits. If she needed water from the snowmelt, someone fetched it. If the fire needed feeding, someone watched it. They didn't owe her. They followed her because she had built something no one else had believed possible. But with numbers came pressure. The council returned, not in the way they had before, with warnings and threats and inspectors. This time, they came quietly, in ones and twos, at night even. First came Joseph Brandt, a merchant from the far side of town. He came with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, cheeks pale, eyes hollow. He brought his 2 daughters and nothing else. His house had collapsed the night before. When the widow opened her door, he said, "I'll sleep in the dirt. I'll dig my own. Just don't make us leave." She didn't. She helped his girls dry their shoes by the stove, showed him the hollow near the west bank of the stream bed, and pointed out where the clay crusted firmest. Next came Reverend Elkins. He didn't ask for shelter, just information. "They're scared," he said, referring to the council. "They don't understand how this place survived, how you survived." She said nothing. "They say it undermines the law, that your way wasn't permitted." She looked him square in the eye. "Neither was starving," she said. The Reverend didn't argue. By the second week of January, the snow was 5 feet thick. Anyone not underground was sleeping in frost, and still, the council refused to speak openly. So the widow did something no one expected. She went into town, walked right into the center square on market day, boots wrapped in canvas, coats stitched from patched curtains, and stood atop the grain barrel outside the old town hall. She didn't shout. She just said, "I have a home that works. I have heat. I have food, I have a dozen families who can vouch for me, and I have proof that your laws aren't written for people trying to survive." People turned, faces pale, eyes sunken, children clung to mothers, breath fogging in the frozen air. "If you want to evict me," she continued, "you'll have to bring a shovel." "Because you'll be digging through solid clay," murmurs swept the crowd, then silence. Then a single voice, Meredith Collins, the same woman who'd once laughed at her hill of dirt, called out, "I want to learn." And just like that, The tide shifted. People who'd once called her crazy now asked for diagrams. Men who'd ignored her began trading firewood for venting advice. A boy from the edge of town brought her a hand-forged iron hook to hang pots from. The widow returned home that evening, boots soaked through but eyes burning with something fierce. Not pride, not quite, but something like justice. That night, as the families shared cornbread baked over coals and dried apple stew, she sat at the head of the table, a long clay shelf packed with wool and lanterns, and listened to the sound of laughter echoing through the chambers. Someone had brought a fiddle. The tune was cracked and slow, but no one minded. It was warmth. It was life. It was everything $25 wasn't supposed to buy. Later, James found her alone near the entry tunnel, checking the draft on the newest vent. He leaned against the clay wall and said, "You ever think you'd build a town?" She smirked. "Just barely. I thought I was building a grave." He nodded. "Same." Then, quieter, he asked, "What do we do when the snow melts?" She stared out the tunnel mouth, where icicles clung like teeth. "We build higher," she said, "but never forget how to build low." Outside, the wind shifted, warmer now, just slightly. A promise that the freeze would end, but not yet. There were still weeks of cold ahead, still families to guide, still shelters to repair and firewood to dry. But inside the earth, the widow sat with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of tea, and the heat of 20 souls echoed off the walls she had built with nothing but dirt, stone, and the will to live. The town might never give her a medal, but it would never forget her, and neither would the frost. By mid-February, the snow began to weep. The sun hadn't come out yet, not fully, not the bright, warm kind of sun that meant spring was near. But something in the air had shifted, a new scent maybe. Damp bark, softened snow, thawed earth curling up from under the drifts. The thaw would take weeks, but it was beginning. Everyone could feel it. Inside the widow's shelter, the air stayed dry and warm. She'd learned how to keep the clay from sweating, lined the ceilings with thin split pine, taught others how to weave dry grass panels that wicked moisture off stone. The vent pipes were now shielded with overlapping shingles salvaged from town ruins. Some had painted them with clay and ash to keep them from rusting further. Little touches that turned survival into something close to living. There were 19 dugouts now. Each had its own layout, its own quirks, but all traced back to her original. And each of them had held, through storms, through frost, through nights that cracked beams in half a mile away. It wasn't just the cabins in town that had failed. It was the idea of them, of building like the East, where winters were wet but short, where foundations stood high and proud. On this land, that pride had buckled under white weight and wind. But the earth never caved, so the widow taught. It began small, passing tools, showing hands how to grip clay, reminding children not to stack logs near vent mouths. But now it was bigger. Each morning, families gathered at her central shelter, where she'd begun to etch diagrams in charcoal on the walls. How to slope a dugout, where to dig for dry soil, how to angle the pipes, how to trap heat, seal smoke, bank coals. She'd taken her late husband's carpenter square and scratched it into the wall beside the arch of the roof with 4 notches. Mark of a warm roof, she called it. She never claimed it was perfect, just that it worked, better than anything the town had offered. By then, she had help. James had grown into something between a foreman and a protector, shoveling, hauling, managing firewood trades between homes. Esther had organized a rotation of mothers to boil water for each shelter, once a day, to keep moisture out and heat in. The widow's camp, some called it, though no one said that to her face. To her they said, "Ma'am," or sometimes just nodded with quiet gratitude. And then one morning someone called her Miss Rourke. She didn't correct them. That day, as she stirred a pot of cornmeal over a bed of hot stones, she heard hoofbeats on the slope above. Not rushed, steady, deliberate. She stepped outside. The sun was just breaking through the clouds, thin rays cutting over the snowy ridge. 2 horses stood at the edge of the path. One carried a courier, young, stiff-backed, dressed too fine for the weather. The other carried a crate strapped in burlap. The courier tipped his hat, his breath fogged. "Miss Rourke?" She nodded slowly. He pulled a satchel from his side and handed her a folded envelope, thick and heavy with wax. "A decision from the county board," he said. Word reached them about everything. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she walked to the crate and undid the lashings. Inside, 3 sacks of flour, a spool of wire, 6 cans of preserved meat, and a letter stamped with the seal of the governor. She opened that one first. "To Mrs. Rourke, it has come to our attention that a number of citizens in your region survived the harshest freeze in recorded history through means not previously considered by our office. We commend your ingenuity. Your records show no deaths, no reported illness, and no complaints. Consider your land claim approved. No eviction, no fines. We request only this. Send us your design." She stared at the words, then reread them. James leaned over her shoulder, eyes wide. "What's it say?" he asked. She handed it to him and walked back into her shelter without a word. Later that night, she finally opened the second envelope, the one with the county seal. It was shorter. The Council of Bracken Hollow formally recognizes your shelter and all supporting structures as legally habitable under emergency code. No further inspection required. She hung both letters beside her fire, pinned with a nail driven through the header beam. But she didn't celebrate. There was too much left to do. The melt would come slowly, and with it, floods, mudslides, roof shifts, clay collapses, earth moving in ways that would test every joint, every seal. So she prepared. She and the others began reinforcing tunnel walls, dug trenches to divert runoff, piled stones around vent mouths to keep them above rising slush. When a small child from Esther's shelter came running, shouting, "It's leaking! Mama says it's leaking!" The widow didn't hesitate. She threw on her coat and boots and sprinted up the slope. A thaw vein had opened in the ceiling above their bedding, dripping a slow but steady line of meltwater. The widow studied the roof, then barked orders. "Bring straw! Bring pitch! Heat a pan, now!" They patched it in an hour. Afterward, Esther stood beside her, panting. "You ever rest?" The widow wiped her brow. "Not until spring," Esther nodded. "It's coming. Not fast enough, but it did come." By March, the snow was melting in earnest. Streams roared. Trees cracked open. The earth smelled like iron and rot and life. The widow stood on the ridge one morning, watching the sun rise over the half-buried town. Smoke still rose from crooked chimneys. But now, it also rose from vent pipes, dozens of them, curling like fingers out of the ground. She looked down at her home. It wasn't pretty, still just dirt and straw and rock. But it stood, it breathed, and it had carried her through the coldest winter in living memory. She had been given $25 and a deadline. What she built had fed, warmed, and saved a community. Later that spring, when a journalist rode out from the county seat with his notebook and camera, she didn't give him a speech. He asked her what it was she built, and how and why. She answered simply, "I didn't build a home," she said. "I built a place the cold couldn't touch." And she turned back to the earth, shovel in hand, still working, still warm, still alive.